Guys, I want to welcome you to another edition of the Project IMG podcast. My name is Asim Ansari, and I am one of the hosts that will be interviewing fellow IMGs during the course of a Project IMG podcast. So I want to welcome all of you to today's show. Today, here with me, I have Claire Jane Marie Stringfellow, MD. Welcome, Dr. Stringfellow. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day being here today. I want to quickly introduce you. You graduated from St. George's University in Grenada, West Indies. Is that correct?
Yes.
Awesome. And when did you graduate, Claire?
I graduated last April, so 2021.
Well, congratulations. How does it feel to be a full-on MD now?
I mean, everyone's excited. I'm excited. I couldn't even believe it, but I think, because of COVID and everything, it's just like the celebrations were a tad deflated. And, I also went through the process of going unmatched. So although I had the degree, I haven't really felt like an MD just quite yet. So I'm still getting there, but.
Well, hopefully this year you match. Today is Friday, so I think we're 2 days away from finding out if you match. So good luck to you. I'm sure you're going to do well. We will talk a little bit about the whole unmatched process and how many interviews you had, how you went through that. And Project IMG is a great resource for IMGs like yourself, for IMGs like me, and it allows you to have free lectures. It allows you to do free certifications for ACLS, BLS, and all the other different sort of medical certifications you can do. It also has a Discord study room where you can join the study room just to study with other people. It is a great project. And the great thing about Project IMG is that it's free, absolutely free. And it is
you got to love that.
Yeah, you do. So if for everyone listening, if you follow Project IMG on Instagram, you can follow them on Twitter, or you can follow the website at www.projectimg.org. So Claire, let's talk a little bit about your life experience before you started medical school. Where did you go to university?
So I went to the University of Arkansas. I wanted to go farther away from home, like I'm sure most kids do when they first, get the excitement of going to college. My parents were like, no way is that happening. So I stayed close to home.
Okay. Did you live at home?
No, I didn't. So I'm from Fort Smith, but the University of Arkansas is in Fayetteville, about 45 minutes north.
Okay. And how was your experience at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville?
I loved it. I had a really good time. I went for a biochem major. So like right off the bat, you meet with an advisor and they're like, what do you want to do? And I wanted to be pre-med along with everybody else. I felt like every time I met someone, they're like, what are you studying? I'm pre-med. But as you go through your studies, you start to see how that group of people that were all pre-med by your senior year were not so much. But no, I had a great experience. But when I went to my pre-med advisors, right off the bat, they're like, you need to set yourself apart. You don't need to just do a basic biology degree. A lot of people do that. And so I'm like an overachiever and I'm like, all right, I'll do biochem and I'll double major in Spanish. So I actually had the dean sign off on one semester because I was taking 21 hours. So college was fun. I did the sorority thing. I was like social chair assistant of a 400 girl sorority. So I had a great time, even though I hardly ever went to the functions because I was always studying for my biochem test. But I made it what it was. The weather is very versatile in Arkansas. So that always made things interesting. But for the most part, college was a pretty good experience for me.
I'm so glad to hear that. Now, you mentioned how you wanted to do medicine right off the bat. You started off with pre-med when you spoke to your advisors. What motivated you to go into medicine?
So my mother has 4 meningiomas. and she was diagnosed with them when she was like 6 months pregnant with me at the age of 29. And she needed to have, an immediate surgery. There was a lot of swelling. They were sitting on her optic nerve, and she was like losing vision in that eye. And they wanted to have an immediate operation, and no one wanted to operate on her because she was a liability for being pregnant. So she ended up having to wait on the brain surgery, and she actually got a call from a neurosurgeon in Charlottesville, Virginia, named Dr. John Jane. And he called her up and was like, "Hey, I've done this surgery before. I've actually like written the journals on it. I would love to do your operation and, I'll save your life and your child's life." And, he did. He, had the surgery, removed them, and she gave birth to me like immediately after. Actually, she gave birth to me first, and then she went in for brain surgery.
Sure.
But anyway, so I grew up going, she'd have follow-ups every year because they are a type of tumor that grows back. And so I go with her to her follow-ups in Virginia. We would drive, it was like 16, 19 hours, I believe, from Arkansas to Virginia for these doctor's appointments. And as a young kid, Dr. Jane would, pawn me off on like a resident or something to watch me. And even when I was in the room with him and he was like explaining things to my mom, he would turn around and explain them to me and show me pictures of the brain and things like that. So at a very young age, I just was like, I want to be like him. And he was my namesake. He was John Jane. And so I took Jane and then my mom's middle name, Marie. And that's how I started going by Jane Marie. So growing up, that's what I went by. So yeah, he was my inspiration.
Wow, that is such an amazing story to hear. And just the fact that at such a young age you were exposed to medicine, and the fact that it was so personal to you, that probably motivated you even more to ensure that you went into medicine. And when you were in university, how were your grades like that allowed you to go into medicine? Like, what was there anything special that you did while you were in school? I know you said you were part of a sorority and you also were studying, and I bet you did your MCAT as well. So how did you manage your time?
So, I mean, looking back, maybe I would have done things differently, maybe not, because I love the person that I've become to be. But, when you first start in like the pre-med track, they're like, they want you to volunteer, be involved in all these extracurriculars and still make the grades.
Right.
So I was under the impression that the more I had stacked on my CV, the more likely I was to get into a medical school. So, I did the double major. I was volunteering at a free healthcare clinic. I was, doing the social chair assistant in my sorority. I was also like working with a Hispanic child, tutoring him. So like all these different things, that I thought mattered. And then what I realized, when it came down to applying to medical school, it was just all about the MCAT. It was just all about the grades. And it didn't matter that I was volunteering in my community, that I was doing research. I was working in a biomedical engineering lab synthesizing gold nano cages. And it just, it was really cool, actually. So I was doing all these things that I thought would get me into school. And when it came down to it, it really just was about the numbers and a lot of who you knew. And and so, like I said, I love the person that I came to be, but it was a struggle. So my grades, I had like a 3.4 GPA. In biochem, I mean, I was impressed with myself. Biochem goes all the way up to like PChem and like Cal 2 and things like that. So it was difficult courses. But had I known that GPA was such a strong factor, like maybe I would have done a different degree. Like I even knew, not saying that like, just dismissing anybody's degree, but I knew people who had gone into medical school on a philosophy degree or on an English degree, because they still managed to do well in their MCAT. I don't think I would have been that type of person if I wouldn't have taken the basic sciences and been in a science degree. I don't think I would have done, how I did on the MCAT. But even then, I didn't have anybody that had pursued an MD degree in my family before. So, I had friends that were taking like MCAT courses and things like that. And I was self-studying and, so I really didn't have like anybody to like walk me through the process. I was constantly on Student Doctor Network, which was like way bigger, 10 years ago than I think it is like right now. But I mean, that was like my guiding source. So I even feel like in the last 10 years of me and my entire medical process, I've really not had at least one strong mentor or source to be like, hey, this is what you need to do. This is the next step. So just the whole process in itself is very overwhelming and, for anyone. And I think if I had a little bit more guidance, maybe my trajectory to medical school would have been differently. And who knows, maybe I wouldn't have become an IMG, but,
You raise a great point about the lack of mentorship, especially as an IMG. I'm assuming that you applied to American medical schools as well.
Mm-hmm.
And you
I didn't.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, well, I didn't apply to too many, because it was expensive and things like that. And, also at Arkansas, like they guarantee you an interview just if you're an in-state applicant. So, I mean, I really felt like I was a strong candidate. So maybe part of me was like slightly delusional, but, and I did have, so at the University of Arkansas, like you have the pre-med advisors, and every time I went to them, they just flat out tell me like, you're not going to cut it for medical school. You're not going to get in. Like I just was constantly told to reevaluate my plan.
Did they tell you why you weren't going to get in?
My GPA. And then I took my MCAT and I had only scored a 24.
Okay. Now, when you were speaking to your advisors, did they mention anything about all the extracurriculars that you've done? You've done so many extracurriculars. So
none of them mattered. And even then, I actually had a roommate whose boyfriend was also applying to medical school at the time. He did no extracurriculars. He wasn't involved in any school clubs. Nothing. And he had a 4.0 GPA and he scored high on his MCAT and he got several interviews to medical schools and actually ended up going into, I believe, like an Ivy League or like a very prestigious medical school. And I remember thinking like, and this guy was really cool, but I just was like, wow, if I would have spent, my entire focus just on my grades, then maybe this would have been different. But I thought the volunteering mattered, the community outreach, everything else. And the thing is it does. So anybody listening to this, I want you to take this with a grain of salt because like it does matter in who you become as a practicing physician later in life. I think it absolutely has everything to do with who I am and who I've become as a physician. But getting into medical school, getting into the States, would I say those things mattered? Unfortunately, no, it didn't for me.
Okay. So you applied to medical schools in the United States where you're from and you weren't able to get in. And did you spend a year applying and not getting in, or did you apply to international schools at the same time in the same cycle?
So I actually applied 3 years in a row.
Okay.
And the first time I didn't get in, I took an extra couple. I just graduated and I decided to stay in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and I was bartending and I was going to save up for the application cycle again. I just worked. And then, I was sitting in the middle of the summer and I was thinking I need to do something different. And so actually kind of last minute, I applied to a master's program. And the only one that was open at the time was in Shreveport, Louisiana, because I waited all summer. Just because the devastation of not getting into medical school was just, it was so hard.
It's tough.
Right. So I kind of sat on it a little longer than I should have. So I missed a lot of opportunities for masters immediately after. So I kind of did a victory lap at my university, took some extra courses, did things, worked. And then I went down to Shreveport, Louisiana, and I got my master's and I reapplied. And it was during that time that I was working in a free healthcare clinic. First actually, so I reapplied while I was in Shreveport, didn't get in again. And then I reapplied. I'm still living in Shreveport and staying there during this time. Now I've finished my master's and kind of doing, I guess, what you want to call a victory lap in Shreveport. I'm just hanging out there. I was working at a hospital there as a scribe, started volunteering in the free healthcare clinic and just kind of revamping my app. And now that my master's was finished, I could work on other parts of my application. And I was working in a free healthcare clinic when I met, he's now one of my best friends. But I met one of my guy friends there, and he was explaining his process to me and how he was also waitlisted at his state school. And he was like, just why don't you apply to the Caribbean? I'm applying. And he's like, we could be roommates. And so I actually ended up applying that January. And I had gotten interviews at a DO school and then UAMS in Little Rock. And when those didn't work out, I just went on and was like, okay, I'm going to start at SGU. And I started that following August.
How was the process of the admission process for SGU? Was it pretty simple?
I don't remember it being like, I mean, I guess it was, like 5 years ago, but I remember there being like the personal statement, things like that. The interview was very chill. It was online. Like you had the opportunity, you could fly out to different locations in the United States, but I was located centrally in Louisiana at the time. So that just wasn't good for me. So I did my interview online, and it was with the person who interviewed me was a recent graduate at SGU. She was great, outgoing, really made me feel like ease. So like, and I had already interviewed at my state school like 3 times before that. So I didn't really have a lot to compare it to. But I did feel, really comfortable in the interview. It was more easygoing. So to me, I felt like the process was, I guess, less stressful.
So let me ask you, I know this is a long time ago, but do you remember any of the interview questions? Or even what they talked about during the interview?
I mean, I just like remember, one of the questions I want to say is like, what do I do when I'm overwhelmed?
Okay.
And that was actually a common question I got asked in my residency interviews as well. Okay. But a lot of it was just talking, and it just being very natural conversation.
Right. So I think if for all the listeners who are listening in right now, it's important to emphasize that you have to be yourself when you're going through the interview, because if you're anything else, it doesn't come off very natural, right? Especially during a conversational interview.
Well, I do want to point out, I've always had a problem in interviews. Like I'm someone who grew up doing dance recitals. I was a Buffalo mascot, in 9th grade. Like I'm a very outgoing person, but for some reason, when I was doing interviews, whether they were in person 10 years ago when I was applying to medical school, or if they were virtual right now for residency, I would just absolutely freeze up, stutter. My face turns bright red. I mean, it was just, I had major imposter syndrome. I wanted this more than anything. I put immense pressure on myself, which a lot of people do. Right. And I just would shut down. So I was a very poor interviewer. So like, I'm saying that it was like conversation natural, but like, I remember being extremely nervous and, it still being difficult, but in comparison to the other med school interviews I have, it not being as like intense.
So if you had to give any advice to listeners for interview skills, what are the top 3 things you think they should focus on?
Top 3 things. So I would focus on really getting ideas together. There's a lot of common interview questions. You can go online and you can find literally thousands of them. And just having some inkling of an idea of what you're going to say, it doesn't have to be completely rehearsed. You don't want to sound completely rehearsed, but just having an idea. And I think that's something I did differently this year, is actually preparing for my interviews. Like, of course, I always researched who was interviewing me, researched the program. That's something that's the basics. Everybody should be doing that. But I wasn't really practicing questions. And so what I would do is I would absolutely practice questions. You have to practice, because some things you don't even think about. And I would practice questions with somebody else and with multiple people. Because like, for instance, like somebody might ask you like one of the questions that people get a lot that's kind of difficult is like, talk about a time where you've had like an issue with someone you've worked with. Like, you're in a professional situation, you're not getting along with someone. That's like a very common question. That's a question that you could probably, easily like rehearse, or you could just like get awkward and be like, well, I've never had problems with someone, because that's not something you just like want to come forward and talk about, right? So that is a question you're going to want to prepare. And by thinking about it, you can actually say what you mean, but now you've thought about it. So it's not just like word vomit, like your thoughts are a little bit more organized. So I definitely would practice questions. The other thing that I would do is practice questions and record yourself. So give somebody, a sheet of questions and be like, ask me like, don't tell me which ones you're going to ask me, like pick them at random and listen to yourself, because, I caught myself saying like a lot, stuttering. I could catch when I would like trail off and start talking in circles. So things like that, like you need to be aware of what you're doing, especially if you can film yourself like on a Zoom. Then you see like how your body language is and things like that, which is important in virtual interviews. And then lastly, like I think the biggest thing is confidence going into the interviews. And that is so incredibly hard for me, for a lot of people to, like really feel like your ish is together when it's literally all on the line. So, I would definitely try to take, like 5 minutes before the interview and just give yourself affirmations. And it might seem silly, but you've got to pump yourself up. You've got to get excited. You've got to like get ramped up, get ready to go get this job, because the minute you doubt yourself, like your voice will crack, you'll lose your train of thought, you'll get, your answers will just echo in your head throughout your interview. And you're constantly just thinking about what you just said instead of, or what you should be saying instead of just being in the moment with your interviewer. So like really take the time to like pump yourself up, like take the time to get ready, do your hair, do your makeup, like wear the outfit that you feel good in, because the confidence like is screamed through the camera and in an interview. And like, that's really important. Like you want to connect to your interviewer, you want them to feel comfortable with you, but you also want them to feel engaged. And, by being confident and engaged, like it makes for a much smoother interview. So take the time to like get excited and pump yourself up.
So if we were to summarize your top 3 tips, it would be know the questions that you're going to get asked, practice them. The second one would be practice speaking,
right?
Being in the moment. And the third one would be confident.
Yep.
Right. And one of the ways that I like to up myself right before anything that I'm going to do is I like to lift my hands up in the air like this and just go, I'm going to do great. And I do this in the mirror over and over again for 5 or 6 times. And I find that it just helps pump you up. And for everyone listening, I think it's important for you guys to notice these 3 tips, because not only will this come in handy for medical school interviews, but it'll also come in handy for residency interviews, and it'll also come in handy for fellowship interviews, and it'll also come in handy for job interviews. So you've finished college, right? You've done the MCAT. You got a 24 on the MCAT. Your advisor's telling you you're not going into medical school in the United States. You've tried 3 years in a row. You've gotten a master's in science from Shreveport, Louisiana State University. And now you've got an admission to Grenada at St. George's University, which is amazing. You're probably pumped. You're happy that you're going to be a doctor. You're excited. Now you get on the island. So I really want the listeners to understand the process of, if you can briefly explain the process of how a Caribbean school works in terms of the semesters, and a quick brief synopsis of the way you guys study and how everything is structured. And then we can talk a little bit about the life experience of living on an island. Okay.
So I went to St. George's University, which was previously mentioned, but so they structure it where you can do your first year in Grenada on the island, or you can do it in England. But you have to do your second year on the island. So you are either on the island for 2 years, or you're in England for a year, and then you're on the island for a year. So you do that for 2 years. And then the last 2 years are your clinicals, and you do those in the United States, or again, you can do them. A lot of students are international and come from all over the world. So some students do go back. They can get approved to do clinical rotations in their countries and other things like that. So it's broken up into semesters. So you get on the island and you're there for four terms, essentially. And
how long is each semester?
About, let's see, like August to December. So like 4 months, 4.5 months.
3 semesters, and there's 3 semesters in a year.
There's 2 semesters in the year, but but when you finish second year, and you go into like your third year, once you start third year, you only get Christmas break. And then you get like a little bit off in the summer, but then you kind of go through the summer. And then you have like your step studying also. So like you get one summer, like your first year of med school. And then you don't get any after that.
So it's straight one after another. You have to continue going. All right. So, and then during your stay in Grenada, you were essentially studying for step one, USMLE step one. Okay. And how was that preparation?
So SGU actually has the reputation of being called a USMLE boot camp. So on day one, I mean, our dean, he's like, look around, every third student is not going to be here. And he pulled up like the statistics from the previous match. And he's like, this is how many IMGs matched. This is what they scored. If you don't score this, like, you're not matching. These are different specialties. And he really just like places the fear in you right then. Right. And so every test you feel like, is this it? Is this going to be the end of my career? Is this going to be the end of my career? Yeah. So
even the school I went to the Medical University of the Americas in St. Kitts and Nevis, and our pass rate was 70%. So if you got anything less than that at the end of the year, yeah, you'd fail the course. And if you had 2 fails, you'd get kicked out of the school. And it's funny that your dean did the whole look and see who the third person is, because they won't be there at the end of second year. And our dean did exactly the same thing. So there was a lot of fear input into you right away that, hey, you have to succeed. And I feel like that fear never ends.
It never ends. Like, you always just feel like on the edge of your seat, and like this opportunity can be taken from you at any minute. But it also really keeps the fire alive. Like, it's the reality of it, right? Like, I know SGU, like, we have about 900 per term.
Wow.
And when I left the island, so they have us take a practice B, BCSE. It's been a minute. They're written by the they're written by the MBA. Right. Yeah. BCSE is what I want to say it's called. But so, we had to score, I think it was like a 75 on it to even be able to leave the island and go study for step. Like, they held you back and you had to wait another term and step study and things like that.
So one of the common practices for all of the listeners is in Caribbean medical schools, when you're done your basic sciences on the island, like Claire just mentioned, you have to take an exam from the NBME, the National Board of Medical Education from the United States. It's a 4-hour exam. It consists of 4 blocks. And each school has their own cutoff for each class, depending on how the class did. And like Claire mentioned, you had to get a 75 or above in order to start your rotations. Is that correct, Claire, for you as well? Yeah, and we had to do the same thing at MUA, Medical University of the Americas. So obviously you passed, you went through, and you finished medical school. Let's talk a little bit about life in the island. How is that?
I mean, when you're in it, you're like, this is the hardest, loneliest thing I've ever done. But when I look back in hindsight, I'm like, I had such a good time. I loved it. I met so many amazing people. I'm someone who loves the beach. I love the tropical environment. So, I mean, I was like in heaven. I love to do things outdoors. So I think it's really about like deciding if you're going to immerse yourself in the culture and the people, which absolutely anybody should do. If you're going to go to somebody's land and, go to school there in that country, like, you need to respect the people, try to immerse yourself in the environment and the culture. But there were some, students who would shut down. We're thousands of miles away from home. A lot of us don't have support systems, significant others, our friends, and like, I didn't have a phone plan, so I could only talk to people when I was on Wi-Fi, so you feel very isolated. And I think that's like one of the biggest things of dealing with a foreign graduate school if you're not from that country. But yeah, so when you get there, you really, try to make friends and try to get to know the locals and, go to the events that are going on locally and like things like that. And of course, we always had like the hot spots that everybody in our class went to. But, I like to go venture off and go to, the random bars and the different places of the island and things like that. So I really took the time to enjoy the experience, although I was struggling, like, mentally and going through the process of medical school. Like, I did try to find time to enjoy the island because it really is a beautiful place. And if you're going to be in medical school, I mean, you might as well go to the beach when you finish a test.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the beauties about being on a tropical island. The beach is always a kilometer away, right? Because
Right.
you're surrounded by water. And you mentioned how you immersed yourself in the culture, and that obviously helped your mental health. And you mentioned how it was really isolating at first. Um, and I'm guessing it's very important to make friends when you're on the island, because they're going to be your friends for 2 years. They're going to be your support system. They're going to be the people that you go to when you have a bad test, or you have a bad day, or your car breaks down, or for some reason, there's some food shortage, or whatever happens when you're on a Caribbean island as a foreigner, right? Because you're
Mhm.
not a local. Any tips for people who are going to a Caribbean medical school in the future on how they can make their life easier when they're on an island?
So one thing I want to say to any IMG student is your classmates are not your competition. And I think, unfortunately, the Caribbean schools really pin you against your classmate. So you're constantly comparing yourself to other people. You are constantly, just wondering if that person's going to take your spot to residency, especially because they make it sound like, only so many leave, and they, would curve tests. So it kind of makes it feel like you don't want to help out, your colleague. And that's not true at all. Like, it's going to be okay. Like, everyone, if everyone makes a 90, then the curve is set at 90. Like, we're all passing. Like, it really is going to benefit you more to reach out to your colleagues, to really lean on them, and don't let that toxic mentality of medical school where you feel like everybody's your competition. They aren't. These are the only people that understand what you're going through.
Right.
You can call your family back home. You can even talk to your SO if they're not in medicine. Like, people really don't get it, and it can be lonely and isolating. Like, you need these people, and honestly, bouncing ideas off of people for tests or people helping you remember tests and remember things, or to make that project for small group. Like, it's really important to, make those friends, establish those colleagues, and like help each other through. And I think that's really what gets you through the whole IMG process.
Absolutely. Great words there. Claire, really, really appreciate all the advice that you're giving to the fellow IMGs. And how is the safety? How is the food? How is the groceries? Like the daily rituals besides medicine? How is life on the island in terms of that?
So if you're from the United States, you're probably going to say inconvenient. We are very spoiled and privileged in the United States, and even in a lot of other countries. My classmates, like I said, from SGU, were like all over the world. But when you're in medical school, it's the most difficult thing you've ever done, and you want some of those conveniences of like going and dropping your laundry off at a laundromat. If you've had weeks of testing and you haven't had time to do laundry, you can just go drop it off at a laundromat. Or if you're in a cubicle all day, hey, I'm just going to DoorDash some food so I don't have to leave the cubicle. Like, those things were not optional in Grenada. And I think that's what people need to understand when you go to a foreign country is you aren't going to have, some of the conveniences that you did maybe back home in your own country. So when you had to meal prep, right? Because if it's midnight and you're hungry, like, you're not eating. There's vending machines on campus for sure, but like, you're not going to have a meal for I will say our campus did have some like late night restaurants, things like that. So we had like what you call Container Park, which was right down the street from SGU. And so they had like late night food and things like that. So there are food options, but past like 1 a.m., not so much, no. So if you're pulling an all-nighter or anything like that, like, you got to plan ahead of time. And it's just like rearranging your routine. If you're someone who likes to go grocery shopping at night, like, that may not be something that you can do on the island. A lot of the grocery stores, they close at like 5 or 6 p.m. So I know SGU like alternated lectures based on like what semester you were. So like first semester had their lectures from 8 to 12. Terms two had their semesters from like 12 to 4 or whatever. And then we had like small group after. So like, you had to like really figure out like, when are you going to have small group, when are you going to have lecture, because you would get out of class and be like, oh no, like, I forgot to go grocery shopping and the grocery store is already closed. And then your day starts all over again the next day, and you're trying to figure out when you can go grocery shopping the next day. So you can't just pop into Publix or Walmart at midnight and get your groceries, or even at 5 a.m. before class starts, which you could do, in some other places. So it was things like that. And then also transportation. So if you were someone who is used to driving your own vehicle back home, on the island, the cars, any of the vehicles, honestly, like the mopeds, the motorcycles, the cars, very, very expensive. Alone, people are paying $6,000 for a vehicle to drive on the island. So I actually started driving a motorcycle because that was a much cheaper option. But
you have to, first time driving a motorcycle?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. I was going to get a scooter because I was living up on the mountain called Montu in Grenada. And the bus only came from campus like twice a day. And if you missed it, like super inconvenient. In the morning, it came more frequently, but in the evening, it's not so much. So yeah, I just decided to get my own transportation, and I told my roommate I was going to get a scooter, and he was like, "No, don't be lame, get a motorcycle." I was like, "I don't know how to drive one of those." He's like, "We'll figure it out." So I bought like a 100cc bike, and he taught me on a gravel parking lot because that's all they have there. And I just drove around, stalled all over town, and eventually figured it out. But
did you need a license?
Yes. Well, so I was bad. I didn't get mine initially when I first got there. It's kind of expensive. And then like also another thing is like, you do have to realize like island time really is a thing. The locals don't tend to feel as rushed, and like we're in medical school. So like our time, like we've, tallied up every minute of our day. Right. Exactly. Right. So you really have to be patient with the people. Like they're just doing their job, and like, they're not stressed out like you. And I know students tend to take their frustrations out on the locals, and that's not okay. So you do have to like, right. So you do have to be, very patient. I forgot where I was going with that. What were we talking about?
That's okay. We were talking about you getting a bike and you getting a license.
Oh, that's what it was. Yeah. So when you go to the DMV there, that's what I was going to say. It would take insanely long, and it was like a half of your day ordeal. So I will say a lot of us wouldn't get licenses, and then the police would actually stake out right in front of campus and would check everyone entering campus on the way to class if you had a driver's license or not, and would give you a fine if you did not have a driver's license. So.
And that's one of the things I think all of the listeners who are listening and should be aware of is when you go to a foreign country to study, you need to follow their rules. You need to follow their culture, and you need to have an understanding of their culture and their rules. Even in my experience, it's very similar, Claire. When I went to Nevis, it was island time. If you ordered a burger, we didn't have any fast food restaurants first off because it was this tiny island. But even when you went to get a burger, it would take 45 minutes. You order a pizza, it would take an hour and a half before, it would be ready for you. And you can get mad about it, but if you got mad about it, it would just make the wait even longer. And it doesn't help you in any way. And I think it helps a lot if you have, like you mentioned, like if you have friends who are locals, you immerse yourself in the culture, you make yourself part of the community as much as your education will allow you to do, because obviously there are educational constraints in terms of working, in terms of, the studying and the tests and just the overall pressure of medical school, which never really goes away. It's like a dark cloud that hangs over your head, right?
Right.
And that never really, really ends. So you've finished your time on the island, right? You've studied for step 1 and you passed step 1. Quickly, can you tell the listeners what you used to study for step 1?
So I was leaving the island, and had heard about a program called, it's like IOMB. It's like the Kansas City Review. I had heard of like a few of my classmates that had used it. Some people really liked it. Some people hated it, but it was like a private, like step studying. Like they held it in Kansas City, twice in the summer, and you signed up for it. There was only so many spots, and like, it was like at a hotel, and like you stayed at the hotel and you had class every morning, and like, in these conference rooms in the hotel and things like that. So I did that. And it was helpful in the sense that I was given some structure, because I had, like I had mentioned before, like when I studied for my MCAT, I didn't have any structure. I was just doing questions all day, every day. and I think that's why my score just plateaued and got stuck. I didn't have the funding or the help, to, push my score further with like other resources. So I decided to do this Kansas City review, and it was helpful in the sense of testing strategy and also providing support and accountability, because they were like, okay, by, every day you have to have this many questions done. And then they would have you meet with one of their like advisors, like teachers that was also an MD that was currently studying for their step 3. And they would meet with you and go over like your testing and like your scores. And we had to take an MBME every week, and we took it together. So we'd all like
MBME every week.
Yeah, it was a 6-week study program.
Tough.
And so, or it was like every 2 weeks, but we took several. I mean, I feel like I was always taking an MBME. So we did that. And it's nice too, because a lot of people go home from medical school and you get so caught up in being back in the United States, you can kind of like get a little bit distracted from maybe studying for your step. So
you're back to what we would call if you've been living in the United States your entire life, or in North America, you're back to normalcy as such, right?
Exactly. All your friends are there.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like the bars are open. I mean, you're just like, oh my gosh, it's,
And I sort of struggled with that too. When I came back after, finished, like when I was studying for step 1, all my friends were home, and it was so hard to say no to them. They're like, hey, why don't you step out? We'll just go out for a couple of hours. And when you're studying for step 1 or for any of the steps, you feel guilty doing anything apart from studying, right? The only other respite you have is maybe sleeping or when you're eating. And even when I was eating, I'd feel so guilty, like, oh my God, I'm eating, but I should be doing questions right now.
Exactly. Exactly. That's how, everyone feels that way. So I actually had friends who stayed on the island. They just stayed and kept paying rent.
Who did that too. Right.
And just because they didn't want to be distracted by being, because you're excited to be home. Your friends are there. Your family is there. Like your old hobbies, routines, things are there.
And you haven't been home in like 2 years. So everyone's so excited.
Exactly.
To see you. Right.
Exactly. And especially when you're like, and I will say one of the benefits of going to a Caribbean school is like you are away from home. So like, this sounds bad, but like your family doesn't expect things from you. Like they're gonna, like my siblings are the ones that get called and pulled and like things like that. So people kind of like do leave you alone for the most part, because you're out of sight, out of mind. But then again, that also just goes back to feeling lonely and isolated.
Right.
So you're not getting that guilt, of needing to do something else, but like, you're just like, well, I'm very lonely. So yeah, I decided to do my studies in Kansas City for that reason. Like I needed a structured program. Everyone tells you like how important STEP is, especially for an IMG. That's what sets us apart. That's going to be different now, I guess, that things are pass fail.
Right.
But you have a lot of pressure on your STEP score. So I stayed in Kansas City, and again, which was like lonely because I was there. And luckily I had 2 of my friends from medical school with me there. So it wasn't too bad. I was able to study with them, and we kept a really good support system going. But I did get pyelonephritis like 11 days before my STEP exam. And I was in the hospital for like over a week and got out, and 2 days later had to take my step 1. So
did the doctors pimp you on what meds you were on?
No, they didn't put me on. Like we were, but like some of my friends, or my 2 friends that were with me in Kansas City, actually came with me to the hospital, because I didn't even go in until I had 104 fever. Oof. Yeah, I wasn't able to drive, so like I had been feeling sick for days, and then the day that I went to the hospital, like my joints were hurting. I was running a fever, and I was sitting in my my step studying course, and the teacher was like wadding up paper and like throwing it at me, and he was like, why are you falling asleep? Like, get more sleep, so you can be rested. Like, you pay a lot of money for this program. Like, wake up, And I was like, I just like don't feel well. And I was like sweating, and I took a Tylenol, and I just thought like, I had other issues like going on. So I was like, it's probably related to this, like whatever. Right. And no, I had a UTI that I didn't have the same symptoms that a lot of people present with UTI. So I didn't know I had one. And it got so bad, and I just had so much pressure because my step was coming up. Like, you don't want to just go to the hospital. Like, So I unfortunately waited till things got like pretty bad and I was really sick. But the doctor was pimping me like, because I had to do a culture and things like that. And they're like, what bacteria do you think it's going to be? And I was like, well, most common is like, Staphylococcus or like E. coli in women, and it's probably E. coli. And, so like stuff like that.
So
But
even on your
yeah.
hospital bed, you're still quote unquote studying a little bit.
Yeah.
In some way or
Actually,
another. Well,
yeah.
you did
And
really well. I mean, on your step one, you ended up getting a 222 after being sick for what, over a week? That's amazing. That's
thank
actually
you.
really, really good. So
Yeah. I mean,
thank
I was
God you
proud of
recovered.
myself, but for wanting to go
Should
into
be.
the field that I wanted to go into, like even then my dean was like, your score is low. So that's also one thing I would say about the Caribbean medical schools is they try to be realistic with you to a point so you don't set yourself up for failure, but it can also be very discouraging
Right.
because there are people with my scores and with my background that get into the same field that I want to go into. But at the same time, they have to be realistic because they want their students to match because it makes their match rate look better. So a lot of times they would prefer us to go into, some of the like primary specialties and things like that, just simply, because those have a higher match rate and that makes them look better. And, of course, you don't want anybody to go unmatched. So they are realistic, but it can be pretty disheartening sometimes.
Okay. So you finished step one. Now you're ready for clinical rotations. Where did you do all of your clinical rotations?
So I was in Miami and I thought I was only going to be there, for a year. So SGU, how they have you do it, you rank the top 3 places that you want to do your clinical rotations. So they have a list of hospitals that they're affiliated with, and you rank 3 out of that list and you write a little blurb of why those are your top choices. Like whether and if you have friends, like they actually have a line where you can list your classmates that also want to go there because they say they try to keep you with like your cohort, your friends,
That's
things
amazing.
like that.
That's so supportive.
Right. But what I found out was if you're not from those areas, so like all my friends that were from New York, New Jersey, they all got placed in clinical rotation sites in New York, New Jersey. So I kind of thought I would be too. But I'm from Arkansas. So they actually ended up placing me in Miami because like there are no clinical rotation sites really centrally located. Yeah. And so I actually got placed in Miami away from a lot of my friends. So at first it was also, again, kind of isolating, but then I ended up making friends in my clinicals who,
well, you're also
helped me get through it.
You're also at home then, right? So that makes it a little easier. And you keep bringing up the fact that you need support, you need friends around you. And I think for anyone who's listening to this podcast today should realize that it's very, very important to have a circle of friends that you can rely on. When I was in the island, we used to, I had a circle of friends and we used to call each other the ride or die crew because they were essentially the only people that you could rely on if anything went wrong. And then that ride or die crew continued throughout clerkships or rotations and all through graduation. And up until this day, we're such great friends and we're always in touch. We're always finding out, hey, did you match? If you match, we celebrate. If you didn't, they try and help you. So it's important in med school to have that support system because you'll need that support system and you need to learn the skills to build a support system also for residency from everything that, we see now. So now you're doing your clinical rotations. How was that experience in Florida?
So I loved it.
How was the third year? Like when you first went to the hospital, how was that? Was it like, oh my God, what am I doing?
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy, right? Because you just study all the time and you're like, you kind of lose focus of what you're actually doing. All that matters is test scores and numbers. And when you get to the hospital, you're like, oh yeah, this is why I went to medical school. And it kind of re your flame and your passion for medicine because you lose out a little bit first 2 years of like your didactic studies, I feel like. But also a really cool thing in SGU, our last semester on the island, they actually let us start rotating in the hospital there. Oh, cool. And, Grenada has different resources than they do in the United States. So it was really cool actually to get to see the different the modalities of medicine, the different way of working around cases when you like maybe don't have the resource, you know. And so, yeah, when we went to the hospitals in the US, I was like, wow, this is really nice. It's so fancy, like, you know, but yeah,
So
it was a lot of fun.
let's talk, like very briefly, talk about the contrast between your clinical experience in Grenada versus your clinical experience in the United States. What was different? Because, you know, a lot of IMGs hear a lot about, oh, you need to have US clinical experience. You need to have US clinical experience. So just to give them an insight into why US clinical experience is so important, can you explain what the difference is between Grenada and the United States and why US clinical experience is so important?
So I think what they really want you to learn, because, you know, there's a lot of physicians that come from all over the world and have practiced great medicine, are great physicians, you know, but one of the things I've noticed from going to one country to another, there are different cultures, there are different resources, and like that it even changes as much as like the questions you ask for like your HPI. Like, for instance, in Grenada, one of the questions you always have to ask a patient is what kind of water do they drink? Is it tap or is it from a water bottle, and do they boil it? Like, those are very important things. And that's not a question I'm necessarily going to think to ask in the United States. And not saying that's the sole reason why they look for that, but it's
Unless
like, it's
you're in
things like,
Detroit.
I don't know anything about Detroit water. Is it gross?
Yeah, apparently. Flint, Detroit is pretty bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
That you bring up such a great point. I mean, it's different, right? I mean, every patient population is different, and you need to realize what each patient population brings and what the environment they're in. What other differences did you notice?
Mostly, and I also think it comes down to networking. What I've realized and what has made especially the difference in my application for residency last year and this year has been networking. And that was even something that was important when I was applying to medical school the first time, and I didn't realize the significance of it. So when you do US clinical rotations, you are able to network more. You're able to get letters of recommendations from physicians in your area. And then when you apply to, you know, hospitals and programs in that area, they look at that, you know, LOI, and they're like, oh, I know so-and-so from this department. Like, you know, medicine is a small field. So when you have that US clinical experience, I really just feel like it's a way for them to, like, you know, gauge who taught you, where you got your training from. It's just a way to network and to get more information on the applicant. I don't think it necessarily just comes down to like quality of skills. Like, you know, do we have to be sure that they have that skill set? Like, those things are important, but, you know, a lot of doctors are going to be, you know, well qualified, but it really just comes down. It's like, who can vouch for you? And if you get US clinical experience, it's kind of just like, it's just like a ticket being like, hey, someone that you may know vouched for me. And I feel like that's kind of where where the difference lies. Is just mostly in the networking aspect of it.
Right. And that's why one of the great things Project IMG does is it allows you to schedule US clinical experiences throughout the United States. And like Claire just mentioned, it helps with the networking. And for all of the listeners, it's very important to realize that when, like Clara mentioned, when you're working with other doctors who are faculty, who are working on a day-to-day basis in the US hospital, they're also looking to see not only what your skills are, but more importantly, can they work with you for the next 3 years? Can they work with you for the next 4 or 5 years for residency? That's so important. And that's why it's so important to have interpersonal skills, to refine your interpersonal skills, to network and have people vouch for you, like you said, Clara. That is so important, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think also another big thing is, like, there are certain protocols that are in place in the US that maybe aren't in other countries. You know, like, there was something recently that went viral on Twitter where an anesthesiologist posted a video of him in the OR, and he filmed the patient and the patient's chart, and it was over some stupid game, Xbox versus PS5 or whatever. It doesn't even matter.
Right.
But the thing is, it's that physician is still practicing. He is still posting on Twitter, and it's because he's not in the US.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't mean that his skills aren't good as an anesthesiologist. He's probably a great anesthesiologist outside the fact he completely disregarded those patients, right? That does not make him good.
Right.
But, you know, like, so it's things like that. Like, I think they also just want to make sure, like, hey, like, were you taught the same ethics? Were you taught the same, you know, patient patient privilege rights, because they do vary from country to country. So it's not necessarily like, hey, how good are your sutures? And I want to make sure that you actually know what gene that mutation was on. It's not about that. It's just, are you comfortable with the way that the healthcare system works in the United States?
Right. And, I think that particular example you give is a great example of, if it was the United States, violating HIPAA, which is probably different in different countries. But in the United States, if you were to do that, you'd be violating HIPAA. So I'm so glad you brought that up. That's so important. So you did your core rotations in Florida. Did you have to schedule your own electives, or did the school schedule them for you?
So no, you had to schedule your own, which is
how did you go about
for
doing
most
that?
schools. So St. George's, a lot of people used a website. I can't even remember what it's called because I couldn't use it. But St. George's isn't registered on it. So a lot of the MDs and DOs in the US use this clinical site. We were not able to. So I use Clinician Nexus.
Nexus.
And it's Nexus with 2 X's.
Okay.
And you send out applications. I would apply like 2 months before whatever rotation it is that you want to go to. But you do have to apply. You have to do a whole onboarding process.
Is there a fee for it?
It's very tedious. I don't remember there being a fee, but you have to like go get your drug tests done. You have to go get your vaccinations done. So paying for those things, like any onboarding that you have to do, but you have to do it like repeatedly for each hospital. Like, so if you save your paperwork, you're good to go. So
if you have to do a drug test for every rotation, you have to do your vaccinations for every rotation, or you just need your paperwork for every rotation.
So your vaccinations and stuff, if you just got your flu shot, just got like your TB, like you can show it, but it has to be within a certain date. And they'll put on there, like, for this rotation, you need, these shots that are good between these dates. So you can like reuse your shot records. But like the drug test has to be within so many weeks of you applying. So if like you took one 6 months ago, you might like, if you're applying pretty closely, like maybe 2 rotations, you can use that same drug test, but you do end up getting drug tested several times if you're switching hospitals. Like every time you switch a hospital, you're going to have to do a whole nother onboarding process, and they're going to ask for a drug test as well with, and it has to be within a certain date.
Okay. Sure. And you scheduled your own electives. What did you want to end up doing?
So I started medical school with the intention of doing emergency medicine.
And did that change throughout medical school, or are you still gung-ho on emergency medicine?
So I wanted EM the entire time. I will say there was about 6 weeks during my trauma surgery rotation in Miami where I was like, okay, I want to do trauma surgery. But I didn't have the step scores for it. And also, one thing I will say with being an IMG is like, I'd be lying if I said that you weren't treated differently in the hospital. You are, even as a student. I think as an attending, people start dismissing that and they don't care as much. But as a student, I really felt like I, wasn't maybe taken as seriously. One of the hospitals I rotated through accepted SG students for rotations, but had never taken one for residency. Well, if that's where you're doing your rotations, then that's who's writing your LOIs. And then, we talked about networking and how important that is. Well, that doesn't help you any, because you want to be able to get letters from places that you're going to be applying to for residency. So what kind of stinks is like your third year SGU assigns where you do your clinicals, and you do all your basic clinicals through one site. So like your OBGYN, your family medicine, pediatrics, internal medicine, surgery, that's all at one clinical site. And, if you want to go into peds or IM, like you really want a letter from your core rotation. And then you also want a letter from, a sub-I or something that you did in the field that you wanted to go into. But what ends up happening is you're at a rotation site where people really don't like take you seriously. If you're paired with another student, like we were paired with students got a little bit more privilege than us. Also, I noticed like the docs would like coerce with the students more. And, I'm not saying that they weren't nice and things like that, but when it came down to like needing a letter, like you would just get no responses, not a lot of support, couldn't really find mentors. So you kind of end up rotating in a hospital that's not supporting you as an IMG or giving you any type of help to, get on your feet. And
That's unfortunate.
Right. So what I recommend for a lot of people, when you do your 4th year and you're picking out your rotations, if you are an international medical grad, like, you want good letters and you want people who are willing to invest in you and write a good letter, because it really makes or breaks your application.
Right.
So you want to do research, like, what clinical sites can I go to that have taken IMGs, and things like that, because those are the people that are going to write your letters. And if they write you a good letter, they're most likely will interview you,
Right.
for a spot when residency comes around. And that's ultimately what you want, right? The whole point of clinical rotations isn't to just learn, but it's to shake hands and network and meet people and try to get a job. So it is kind of hard if you get put in a hospital where, they don't have IMGs in their graduate programs, like, that's a whole year wasted where you could have been meeting people and getting great letters and things like that.
Right.
So that was kind of an unfortunate part of all of that.
So the takeaway from everything you've said today, from what you've said right now, is when you're scheduling your 4th year elective rotations as an IMG, try and pick places where there are already IMGs present, where IMGs are valued, where there are IMG residents, versus places where you don't see any IMG residents. And sometimes you might be attracted to a hospital or a location which is really nice, like Florida. It's sunny, it's bright, everything's wonderful. Or you get a rotation at Johns Hopkins or some really high Ivy League elite school. However, if they're not going to take IMGs, is it really helping you?
Right. Exactly. Because it's your time, like I said, to like network and really get a strong letter of recommendation.
Right.
And so you don't want to waste that.
And it's so unfortunate that there is that stigma with IMGs versus American grads, even though you're rotating at the same hospital, you're seeing the same patients.
We took the same USMLEs.
Yeah. And it's so unfortunate. And hopefully Project IMG will be one of those organizations that will help and take care of that, like get rid of that stigma. And I think with all of the opportunities that Project IMG offers by their observerships, by the US clinical experiences, and by all the different means of resources available to people who access Project IMG, hopefully that stigma will slowly dissipate. And you finished your clinical rotations, you took your step 2, right? And on your step 2, you got a 232, which is such a marked improvement from your step 1. And hopefully this time you weren't sick before.
No.
which is great. Did you take a prep course for step 2 as well?
I didn't. I didn't have the money. And I kind of just took what I liked about the program that I did for my step 1, like how like you approached questions, like how the critical process went. Like I liked that and I kept that. But I mean, you're in clinicals and you're stressed out and you're like, it's just really hard to get any type of like organized system. At least it was for me. So I just worked on UWorld, and did like Amboss, and then just like really tried to stay like on top of my shelves and things like that.
Okay. And like one of the things with the USMLE is it's, as much as it is a knowledge and comprehension exam, it's also very much a test taking exam. So you need to learn the test taking strategies. So for all of the IMGs listening today, do you have any advice on test taking strategies?
So one of the best things that I did for myself before taking any type of like block that analyzed my score, like any type of practice exam or anything, is do a timed practice block first. Because my hardest part was turning my brain on to like timer mode when I would start practice exams. And I always ran out of time on my first block. Would always run out of time. I would have a hard time like getting my thoughts together quickly. But then by my second block, I was like warmed up. So I was like, someone had told me like, why is your first block on your actual test your warm up? You should be doing a block before that. And I was like, oh yeah, duh. So I actually started doing that. And that also like calmed my nerves. It gets you into the mode. And like, a lot of times I did really good on it because I didn't have the stress of like, okay, this is an actual exam. So I would do good on that block. And I'm like, oh, hell yeah. So I'd be going into my practice exam feeling pretty good,
Right.
So it was more helpful.
Right.
So I think that's really important is always practice how you're going to take the test. So what I did for step 2 is anytime I did a block, it was always timed. I never did an untimed block. So that was a little bit different. For step 1, I would just like leisurely click through questions and then occasionally like do timed blocks. For step 2, I only did questions and blocks.
What resources do you use for step 2?
I just used the UWorld, and then I did a little bit of Amboss, but not so much of it.
And you found
mostly UWorld
was sufficient enough. Did you use any textbooks?
The first aid.
First aid you used? Okay. Okay. And you ended up doing really well on step 2. Obviously, your test taking strategy worked. You passed the OET on the first time. You didn't have to do step 2 CS because we were beyond that point. You were a COVID grad, so you had to do OET. And you passed that on the first time. Any tips for the IMGs who will be taking the OET?
I do have some tips. But one thing I wanted to mention real quick before we moved on.
Sure.
I do want to put out there, when I first moved to Miami, like I didn't have money, I didn't have transportation, things like that. I was living in a basement off my Miami Beach. I was taking like Ubers and things like that to work. I mean, it was a very like stressful time. So my very first shelf actually was surgery. And so for anybody that doesn't know what a shelf, it's an NBME exam. And essentially all your shelves are kind of what make up the step 2. So I had surgery, and, surgery alone is a very hard rotation. And I was in trauma surgery. So there was like no downtime, especially because I'm in trauma surgery in Miami. Like there's not a whole lot of time that you're just sitting around. So I didn't even know how to study for a shelf. Like NBMEs, are difficult exams. They almost feel like they're tricking you the entire time. So I actually failed my surgery shelf. And then my next block was IM, which is also the other hard shelf. And, IM and surgery are both 12-week blocks. Like a lot of rotations are like 6 weeks, but surgery and IM are like the longest blocks. And I was in IM, and I just, I'm still dealing with the same struggles of, I'm in Florida, my family's in Arkansas. I wasn't able to work on the side. I only had a minimum amount of student loans. I still didn't have transportation. I didn't have friends yet. I was slowly starting to make friends in clinicals, but they were living in, more expensive apartments in downtown Miami. And I was living in North Miami Beach because it was cheaper. So even the few friends I did make, you don't get to see them all the time. Right. So, I did like, struggle with, loneliness and, the other aspects that come with medical school. But, so my IM shelf comes around and I failed that one too. So our school has a rule, like you can retake the shelves, but you can't fail them twice. You can only fail them once.
That's a lot.
And you have to pass all of your shelves to even graduate.
Right.
And, and I just remember, going to study for my step 2. And I'm like, and everyone's like, the biggest part of your USMLE step 2 is IM and surgery. And I'm like, cool, those are the shelves that I failed. Right. So, actually when I went down to study for step 2, like I was like, I'm not going to do good on this because these are the, it's heavily weighted on the parts that I didn't do very well in. So I actually like drilled myself on mostly surgery and IM questions. Like I knew that's where I was lacking. And so that's really where I concentrated on. And I actually had to retake those shelves, and I ended up honoring both of them over a year after I took the initial rotation. So even though I hadn't been in surgery for a year, because I took them, I actually didn't even take my shelves till after I took my step 2. So I took my step 2, which my school doesn't like us doing, but there's a lot of us. So I kind of flew under the radar. Otherwise, I don't think that they would have, liked me to take my step 2 and apply. But I wanted to apply for residency. And I was like, these shelf scores like don't matter. It's the difference for SGU. If you make an A on your shelf, it allows you to honor the rotation.
Okay.
So if you get an A in like the clinical work, you have to get an A on the NBME exam, the shelf at the end, and then that's how you get an A plus, which is considered honors. So it only gave me a B in my surgery and my IM rotation, which is annoying, but it didn't fail me. So I could theoretically apply to residency.
Right.
So I went ahead and applied and did all of that. So I actually didn't take my surgery and IM shelf till a year after those rotations, and months. It was like 6 months, 7 months after I actually took step 2. So I had to go back and study for those things,
Right.
and I was like, I really hope I pass this, because if I don't pass this, I'm supposed to graduate in 2 months and they're not going to graduate me. And I've already applied to residency, and I actually ended up honoring both of those shelves. So like,
that's amazing.
I just took my weaknesses and I actually made them like the strongest thing about, my testing strategy, and it really paid off in the long run. So, but I was just trying to point out that like even the process of me getting to taking the step 2 was difficult, because I wasn't passing my shelves, because I had a lot of personal stuff going on in my life at the time, and was living in an area where I still had no friends, still had no family, and wasn't able to like hold a job because I'm in clinicals and studying all the time. So it was a very stressful time. And I think, when you go into medical school, it's everything else. It's not just making the grades. It's literally surviving the process, which can be very difficult.
Well, I think we need to commend your resilience and your mental strength of getting through that tough situation and finding a way to ensure that you ended up achieving all of your goals for finishing step 2 and flying through all the hoops that were required. That's absolutely amazing. I think you should be giving yourself a little bit of credit for that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think
I'm pretty proud of myself.
You should be too. And I think that's one of the important things that the listeners need to realize too, is that when you're faced with adversity, you have to push through it sometimes. And that happens a lot, especially when you're an IMG, because you don't have to deal with, as another grad, you don't have to deal with high shelf scores. You can just pass it with a lower shelf score, right? I think even when I was a student at MUA, our shelf scores, you needed a 75 plus to pass, and 75 on a shelf is not easy. It's
right.
It takes a lot of work to get 75 on a shelf. So kudos to you, Per, for achieving that. Even when you had no support, you were financially strained, you were still in rotations, and to still do that, that's absolutely amazing. And
thank you.
So you finished step 2. You applied for residency, and as we know, you didn't get in on your first year, which was last year. What did you do to improve your application? And in your first year, how many interviews did you have?
So in my first year, I applied to emergency medicine, and I only had 4 interviews. 2 of them came like very early in the cycle. And then the other 2 I got because they were newer programs and they opened in January, and I was blowing up the program director's emails like, hey, give me an interview. And they did. So I ended up with 4, but unfortunately I didn't match. So I had done an audition rotation in the emergency department at one of the ERs in Miami. And this was a program that had previously taken SGU students, at least 2 a year in their ER program. And I really felt like I got along with the residents. I really tried hard to like bust my ass, make a good impression. I loved the environment, and I felt like I was a shoo-in, not necessarily like a shoo-in, but I felt confident about it. I knew I loved the place, and, the residents were asking me to hang out after hours. Like I went snorkeling and diving with some of them,
so you were still networking.
Right.
Right.
And I genuinely just got along with it well. So I will say, so when I went through the application process the first time, I, unfortunately was dating somebody new, not so new. We'd been dating for like 3 or 4 months, and he was like really serious about me, and like, he didn't want to leave Florida. And I'm someone who really likes the warmer climate. So I didn't really want to leave Florida. And I was very naive about this process. Like I kind of just felt like, I rocked my audition rotation. Like this was it. It was going to be okay. Everyone's like, you just need one to match. And I was like, this is my one to match. It's where I want to go. I want to be here. It's perfect. And so when I went through the process of applying, like I was just kind of blindly applying to places that I wanted to go to. based off of like location and, you know, where I liked, and I was really getting input from my significant other. And also during this time, you know, COVID is happening, and I, you know, went to have my transcript uploaded, and I realized my entire third year is missing from my transcript. And it was just unfortunately one of those things when you graduate from a class of like 900 students and the secretaries are out because of COVID, paperwork gets missed and things happen. And unfortunately it happened to me. And so, I didn't, oh, it's okay. I mean, honestly, if I had filled out my application sooner, I would have caught it sooner. I could have had it fixed, but I had such severe anxiety about the application process. I put it off until literally the day before. I'd been working on my personal statement and my CV, of course, but I hadn't actually submitted it and like looked at all my uploaded documents until the day before. And that's when, you know, I noticed that. And I actually, and you can't look at your transcript from ERAS. So I didn't notice it from that. I had asked for a copy from the registrar because I needed it for something else. And that's when I was like, is this what's on file? Because this is what I uploaded to ERAS and there's my whole third year missing. So that really was unfortunate. And I know I wasn't the only student to have that happen to. In addition,
imagine the stress when you first saw that or clicking on ERAS, and like, oh my God, what just happened? You probably panicked.
Well, but the thing is, it's like you kind of are just thinking that everybody looks like that because everyone had a hard year with COVID. So you're like, well, maybe they'll be more lenient. No, definitely there were students that had their shit together because they are the ones that got the jobs. So that happened. And then also I had a letter writer who I was really banking on his letter, and he, you know, his secretary got sick and he kept putting it off. And like, as a student, you really feel bad about harassing some of your preceptors. But they are busy people. And so like you teeter this, like, am I like reminding you or am I being annoying now? And he actually didn't upload my letter until like 2 months after the application services went out.
Oh, wow.
So it just was overall like a bad year for me. Like I didn't do the research, you know, as an IMG, you have to research who is even going to take IMGs.
So to put it bluntly, you weren't prepared.
I was not prepared. I took the process for granted. Like I kind of just, I had this confidence in myself, and then it wasn't till I saw the lack of interviews that I was like, oh no, like, you know, and that's when I would, you know, have the interviews. And then in the interviews themselves, I would shut down, freak out, like talk in circles. I just really had poor interviewing skills, and I had severe imposter syndrome from only having 4 interviews when a lot of my peers applying for the same specialty had like 7 or 8. Right. So yeah, it was a very difficult process, but that was the biggest difference between last year and this year is just the amount of preparedness. Like as soon as I found out that I didn't match last year, I mean, I think I had like 3 days. So the whole week of SOAP, I mean, you're in gear, sending emails, calling people. You don't really have a lot of time to be emotional, but the week after that begins a scramble, and that kind of continues indefinitely as programs fill spots all year long for whatever reasons. And, you know, so I think I had about 3 days where I was like on the couch crying, not eating, like, you know, like really couldn't function. And then I just had to get into gear. You know, I like did the math and I was like, okay, I have 5 months until my application goes live again. What can I actually get done in 5 months? It's going to make a significant difference. And so, you know, I really went into the cycle more prepared, and how, you know, I did the research on all the applications and like where I was sending my application to, like what programs and whatnot. And, you know, I just, you know, I rewrote my personal statement. I revamped my CV. I found mentors in my field, and I definitely did not take this process for granted. So I, you know, when I worked to save up the money to apply for the application process the second time around. So yeah, you have that time where you have that panic when you don't match, but then you also have to realize that you have a very small time to make a significant difference on your application before the next cycle begins.
And just to put into contrast the difference preparation makes, on your first year, you had 4 interviews.
Mm-hmm.
And how many interviews do you have this year?
This year I have 17.
Wow. So. That's like more than 4 times the amount of interviews you had last year. Isn't that amazing? Wow.
Yeah, I'm really stoked. So
yeah.
I mean, it just shows it really makes a difference.
I think preparation makes such a great difference. And just your example right here, and for anyone who's listening, it's so important to be prepared for match, to have all your documents in order, to double check things a million times, even though it causes you anxiety. It's important to do, and to have all your eggs in your basket. And I think this year you also networked a lot more. Like you said, you had mentors, you reached out to mentors, and Project IMG has it's a place where you can find mentors who know what they're talking about, who will be invested in you. And it makes it a lot easier to find mentors, because I know before Project IMG, I had trouble finding mentors too, because you have to keep searching and searching and searching. And then eventually you come across someone that believes in you. So I want to say good luck for this year's match. I know it's 2 days to go, Saturday, Sunday, and then Monday, 8 a.m. Central Standard Time, we find out if we matched or not. I am so stoked for you. I am pretty sure you will end up matching this year. And I want to wish you the best of luck, Claire. You've given us your time today, and I really, really appreciate it. Is there any final words you have for all of the IMGs listening today in the Project IMG podcast that you would like to tell them? Anything?
I do want to say, being a doctor was the only option for me. It's the only job I have ever wanted, and I completely relate and empathize with people who want nothing more than to be a physician. It's more than a career. It can be like your lifestyle, if you have that passion for the sciences and for helping people and things like that. So when a lot of us are IMGs for a reason, whether it was, you had a difficult journey that prevented you from going to the school in your country, or maybe you felt like or maybe you didn't get the scores that was required to go to school in your country. Like, that doesn't disqualify you from becoming a great physician. And people along the way are going to challenge you emotionally and, going to really cause you to question if you have the abilities to accomplish these things. It is a hard journey. I'm not going to lie and say that it's easy. You are discouraged at every corner, from some of your classmates, from your dean, to your family who, misses you and hasn't seen you in forever. Maybe by your significant other who you've dragged to another country to do this process with you. It is not easy. It's not easy when you ran out of money in the middle of the week and you're trying to figure out someone to wire you something, or you can't call home or anybody else without Wi-Fi service. Like, it's going to be the hardest thing you have ever done in your life. But I'm going to say that it's still possible. You can still do it. You can still be a physician. Just, you have to realize the amount of sacrifice and passion you have to have for this, because it's going to feel like nobody has your back. But actually, there's a lot of IMGs like me, like Asim, who are going through this process that are willing to take the time to help. So reach out to the other IMGs, like all around the world. We are a huge group of us. Like, even though we all go to different Caribbean schools, we all go to different international schools, we are bound by the fact that we are IMGs. So lean on your fellow IMGs. Also being in the Caribbean or being in an international school, you're going to get great experience meeting people from all over the world, from all different countries. When you have your small group and someone's like, how does it, what's it like living like this type of person, or living with this color skin, or, what is it like being this gender? Like, you get to hear about everyone's different experiences, and it's not always as colorful as maybe it is when you're back in the States and everyone kind of comes from, a lineage of doctors or things like that. Like, you really get to see wonderful people who have the same passion as you. So what I'm saying is just like, work hard, don't give up, and ask for help. Always ask for help. Ask your friends, find a mentor, even talk to your deans, even though they're scary. Just take what they say with a grain of salt. It's kind of like a liability thing, I feel like, but work hard. It's definitely possible, but you have to realize it's never going to be easy. It's not a cakewalk. And there's, like I said, there's going to be obstacles at every corner. So really lean on the people around you and the people in the similar situation, and, have faith in yourself, because it will happen eventually.
And like Dr. Stringfellow said, seek help. And that help is available at Project IMG for all things IMG. Dr. Stringfellow, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out for being here today. I enjoyed our conversation so much. It was so nice to hear the insights of your experiences, your entire journey from America to Grenada to back to America. And now you're sitting here with 17 interviews ready to match in 2 days. It's with your ups and downs. It's been so exciting. I want to wish you the best of luck, not only for Monday when you find out if you're going to match, but also for the rest of your career. I think you are going to be a stellar physician. You are already a stellar physician, and you will have an opportunity in a couple of days to show the entire world how good of a physician you are. So thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate you being here today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. And for all of the listeners listening today, check out Project IMG on Instagram. It's at Project IMG. Check them out on Twitter at Project IMG. And check out the website, www.projectimg.org. Project IMG is a free IMG-based organization for all things IMG. I want to thank you all for listening tonight, and have yourself a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other and be kind to yourself. Have a good night, everyone.